Hi, my friends. Today I want to present you a new story. Enjoy watching it.
I grew up in a modest house tucked into a quiet neighborhood where sunlight danced across the picket fence and dappled the porch swing. My father, Robert, was a gentle soul who filled our home with laughter. He had a knack for storytelling. His tales were woven with such warmth and humor that even the most mundane days sparkled. "Abby," he'd say, hoisting me onto his shoulders after dinner, "the world is your oyster. But you've got to keep a little grit to make your pearl." His laughter was contagious, and I'd giggle so hard I'd nearly topple over. My mother, Ellen, was the opposite. Reserved, pragmatic, and often distracted, she seemed content in the background of our family's picture. She loved my father, of that I was sure, but her love was like a locked box, present but difficult to access. Life was simple, and I thrived in my father's affection, soaking up his attention like a sunflower turns to the sun. But shadows crept into our lives when I turned 10. One crisp autumn morning, my father clutched his chest and collapsed in the garden, where we'd been raking leaves. "Dad!" I screamed, shaking his shoulder. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. I ran inside, my heart pounding, and found my mother in the kitchen. "Mom, something's wrong with Dad." She dropped her coffee cup, porcelain shattering on the floor. Her reaction was swift, almost mechanical. "Call 911, she barked, racing outside. The ambulance came, but it was too late. My father was gone. The days after felt like walking through a fog. My mother withdrew even further, retreating to her room for hours. It was my grandmother, Caroline, who stepped in. A wiry woman with silver hair and a fiery spirit, she pulled me into her arms and became my anchor. "Your father loved you fiercely, Abigail," she whispered one night as we sat on her porch swing. "And I'm here for you always." Her words were a balm, but nothing could fill the gaping hole left by my father's absence. Those days were a blend of light and shadow, a childhood touched by joy and tempered by loss. It was a crisp spring afternoon when my mother returned from one of her increasingly frequent errands, wearing a smile I hadn't seen in years. She sat me down in the living room, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. "Abigail," she began, her tone too careful, "there's someone I want you to meet." The door creaked open, and in walked Derek, tall and broad-shouldered, his grin polished but hollow. Beside him shuffled a boy about my age, his gaze darting around the room like he was casing it. "Frank." "Hello, Abigail." Derek's voice was overly cheerful, almost rehearsed. "Your mom has told me so much about you." I glanced at my mother, searching for some explanation, but she only nodded expectantly, as if I were meant to leap into their arms with joy. "Hi," I replied flatly, my eyes narrowing at Frank, who was already eyeing the bookshelf with a smirk. Later, over a stiff dinner, Derek and Frank made themselves at home. Frank barely looked up from his plate, his feet stretched arrogantly under the table. "So, Abigail," Derek asked, his fork pausing midair, "how do you feel about having a little brother?" I froze, my grip tightening on my knife. I didn't know I had a choice. "Abigail," my mother snapped, her voice sharper than I'd heard in years. "Don't be rude." Frank snickered, and I shot him a glare. I wasn't being rude, just honest. The tension simmered through the meal, and by the time they left that evening, I felt as if our small home had been invaded. My mother, however, seemed transformed, lighter, even. "They'll be moving in soon," she announced casually as she cleared the table. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Derek and Frank are going to be part of our family now," she said firmly, not meeting my gaze. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the air thick with unease. Something about Derek's charm felt forced, and Frank's smirk lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't here for us. They were here for something else entirely. It happened one evening when I came home earlier than expected from a study session at the library. The house was unusually quiet, save for the muffled voices coming from the kitchen. Curiosity tugged at me, and I tiptoed closer, staying out of sight. "This money is for Abigail," my mother said, her voice low but tense. Derek's response was sharp. "She's a child. What does she need with that kind of money? Frank's college isn't going to pay for itself." My breath caught in my throat. They were talking about the inheritance my father had left me. "She doesn't even appreciate it," Derek pressed. "We're building a future here." Don't you want what's best for Frank? There was a long pause before my mother's voice came again, weaker this time. I don't want her to hate me. She'll get over it, Derek replied dismissively. Kids always do. My hands shook as I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. The audacity, the betrayal, they weren't just taking from me, they were taking what was left of my father's love, his legacy. Unable to stay silent, I stepped into the kitchen. So that's the plan? Rob me blind and call it building a future? My mother turned pale. Abigail, you what? I cut her off, my voice shaking with anger. Thought I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't care? Derek stepped forward, trying to appear calm. Now listen, Abigail, this isn't what it seems. No, it's exactly what it seems, I snapped, glaring at him. You're just here for the money, aren't you? Frank appeared in the doorway, holding a bag of chips and smirking. You really think it's all about you, he sneered. Get out, I said, my voice trembling but firm. All of you. My mother reached for me, her eyes filled with tears. Abigail, please, we're a family. No, I said coldly, stepping back. We're not. I stormed out of the house, my heart pounding. The betrayal burned deep, but so did my resolve. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them take what was mine. Years passed. I lived with my grandmother Caroline, who was my guardian and inspiration. We rarely communicated with our mother. At night I worked as a cleaner at a local hospital. One of these nights came at dawn phone call. The ringing jolted me awake, and before I even answered, a sickening dread settled in my chest. Abigail. The voice on the other end trembled. It was Mrs. Collins, my grandmother's neighbor. It's Caroline. She passed in her sleep last night. The words hit me like a thunderclap. My hands trembled as I held the phone. No, I whispered, my voice cracking. There must be a mistake. She was fine yesterday. I'm so sorry, dear, Mrs. Collins said softly. She loved you so much. I hung up without saying goodbye, my mind reeling. Just hours earlier, we had shared tea and laughter. I remembered her gentle smile and the way she always tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. Now, she was gone. The house felt foreign when I arrived. My grandmother's warmth seemed to have evaporated, leaving a cold emptiness behind. As I entered, I found my mother, Derek, and Frank already there. Derek was rifling through a drawer while Frank leaned lazily against the wall, munching on an apple. What are you doing? I asked, my voice sharp. My mother turned, avoiding my eyes. We need to figure out the financials. You know, to manage the estate. The estate? I spat. This is her home, you can't just. This house is in play now, Derek interrupted smoothly. And given everything, Frank needs it more than you do. My fists clenched. This house was promised to me. It's the only thing I have left of her. Frank smirked, tossing the apple core into the sink. Don't be so dramatic. It's just a house. I stared at them, the grief now mixing with rage. You won't touch this place, I said firmly. This house is mine. I'll fight you if I have to. My mother finally met my eyes, her expression unreadable. We'll see what the will says, Abigail. I stormed out, slamming the door behind me, the ache of loss burning alongside my fury. My grandmother was gone, but I wasn't going to let her memory be trampled. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. The day of the will reading arrived, and I sat stiffly in the lawyer's office, my hands clenched in my lap. Across the room, my mother perched next to Derek, her face composed but her eyes flickering with anticipation. Frank lounged beside them, looking entirely too smug. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling the papers on his desk. Caroline Franklin's last will and testament is as follows, he began. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. To my granddaughter, Abigail, I leave my home and all my savings. I trust her to care for the house and uphold the values we shared. To my daughter, I leave my love and hope for her future. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Derek's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, he barked. That house should go to Sharon, it's her mother. The lawyer adjusted his glasses calmly. This will is legally binding, Mr. Turner. My mother's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Abigail, you don't need that house. Think of Frank. He's still a child. No, I said firmly, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. Grandma trusted me with the house, and I won't let you take it. Frank rolled his eyes. What's the big deal? Just sell it. You're too young to handle a house anyway. I stood, meeting his gaze. The big deal is that this house was my home. It's the only place I ever felt safe, and I won't let you destroy that. Derek sneered. We'll contest this in court. Go ahead, I shot back. But you won't win. The protests faded into the background as I left the office, clutching the will in my trembling hands. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of strength, a sense that I could stand on my own. That evening, as I walked through the house, I felt my grandmother's presence in every corner. The scent of lavender in her room, the creak of the floorboards she always meant to fix. I smiled through the tears. This house was mine now, not just in name but in spirit. It was a place of love, resilience, and hope. A place where I would begin anew, carrying Caroline's legacy forward.
Friends, what do you think of this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Would you like more stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss any videos. See you tomorrow.